Hello, everybody. Welcome. I am Bethany Ruhe. I am a public relations and public affairs corporate communications consultant. I've been working with Jason and the Z Prime crew since the second Energy Thought Summit, and it's great to be here and great to see all of you. We are going to be talking today about resiliency and reinforcing our energy grid, a topic that I know has been discussed a lot, and I'm really excited to add our part to the conversation. I'm here today with Ruhe Gerbrandt, CEO of Anterix. Did I say that right? Oh.
No?
No.
Oh,
Yep,
there we go.
you're good.
You did. Thank you. COO, however.
COO.
So, yeah.
Oh, darn. I
Not
knew
to take
I was going to mess up
Not to take a
something.
self-promotion on the stage.
And Sam Chang, who is Director and General Counsel for CenterPoint Energy. Thank you both for joining us. So I want to talk about LTE networks and how they play into this whole resiliency conversation. So I wanted to kick it off with you to kind of give us that 40,000-foot view into the work that you're doing.
Excellent. Thank you. And again, thank you, Bethany. Thank you, Jason, the entire Z Prime team. It's fantastic and an honor to be back here again at ETS. Yeah, let me try to broaden the aperture a little bit too, Bethany, as we think about LTE and kind of communications technologies. So Anterix, we are a broadband wireless communications company. A lot of folks, might ask, what are we doing at a utility sector event? We look at it this way. Yes, there's, kind of a major, community ecosystem market, in telecom. So is a long tradition of telecom operations within utilities, and we see this as an opportunity to really drive convergence of these mega sectors where, telecom is operated independently and largely so has utilities. It takes some creative thinking to be able to put together the pieces of how you do that effectively to take advantage of all the positives that comes from the telecom sector and bring it in and make it portable to the utility industry. And so when we describe it, as Bethany said, it's LTE technology, but the space that we live in is really, around private, and so it's ultimately private LTE. LTE technology, just for, kind of common sense, all of you have cell phones. It's the very technology that's in your cell phone today. And why that matters is that it allows us to tap into a global ecosystem of R&D. Billions of dollars, is being pumped into that technology globally. And it's been very inaccessible to utilities or sectors, outside of telecom for a long, long time. And so we're adapting and bringing in that technology portfolio, all the major players that invest in that technology all around the world, the experiences that the carriers have providing consumer services to us, as users, and making it portable and adaptable for utilities. And we're doing that now, across, 7 different utilities. We got 15 states, under deployment. One I'm super excited about that we were talking a bit about backstage is actually right here in Texas. Already in Texas, 93% of the counties in the state of Texas are in active deployment with private LTE. And that really speaks to kind of the localization effect here and the recognition with Encore, LCRA, and Xcel Energy to the value proposition that broadband can bring as they think about a variety of different use cases and applications. Now, the other piece that goes with it, as I said, is private. Now, what private means, and this is where it varies from how the public networks use it, networks are built for a purpose. They're built for a specific set of use cases and specifications. Us as consumers, are a very specific demographic and use case when it comes to how a carrier builds their network. And our expectations of consumers are such that we can survive, a little downtime if it's not working. We're understanding, in terms of how that works. We may not like it, but we can accept it. To a utility, that's not practical. The very use case of how a utility will use a communications network, and I'll put it in the perspective of resiliency and storm recovery, it is the very toolkit that we will use to dispatch our line crews, to communicate work orders, to do system monitoring and real-time understanding about what's up and what's down as we're doing storm recovery. The very network that you use for that needs to be more reliable and resilient than the grid that you're trying to bring back online. And I think it's an often underlooked feature of what rural communications brings. And so by private, you control every aspect of it. You control how you build it, the type of towers that you're building it on, the backup battery supply, that you're putting at those locations. And utilities, as a result, will build a very different communications network than what the carrier will to be able to support the fundamental grid operations that they want to support. And I know specifically here we're talking about resiliency. The communication system itself, is fundamental to how we think about digital enablement across all corners of the grid. And our philosophy is very much that we're on an industry journey to bring digitization out to the last mile, of every aspect of the grid, out of the substation, out of the generating plants, out to the edge consumer, where the edge of the distribution lines are that we're trying to support. And all of the technology adoption that we see out there in the technology community today is inherently digital, right? It's connected, it's communicated to, it's controllable, and that means there's a fundamental assumption that all of those things that we put out there, as utility operators will inherently be connected and plays into how utilities think about grid resiliency and the different components that go with it.
Well, so speaking of utilities and how they think about grid resiliency, Sam, I'd like to ask you at CenterPoint, I know you have your Greater Houston Resiliency Initiative. I know you guys are doing a lot of work there, so I'd just like to hear, sort of what some of those things are and sort of the journey that you guys have been on and where you're at in the initiative.
Sure, and just a brief introduction to CenterPoint Energy. So we have the privilege to serve the Greater Houston area, which is about 2.8 million customers in what I think is the fourth largest metropolitan area in the country. We've been growing at a 2% clip for the past 10 years, and for the foreseeable future, we think that is sustainable. And to equate it tangibly, we always say it's like adding the city of Waco every year. And so we have the privilege to serve the Greater Houston area, and as it relates to resiliency and the Greater Houston Resiliency Initiative, resiliency is not something that's new or foreign to us. It's something that utilities do as part of kind of their ordinary course of business. And so you have things like hardening your structures, additional vegetation management, additional automation. So these are things that we've been doing since time immemorial. And just to give an example, when Hurricane Ike hit in 2007, 2008, it took us about 3 weeks to restore power. When Hurricane Beryl hit last year in July, that took us 11 days, and we had over 2 million customers out. Within 2 days, we had already restored 1 million customers, and that's largely attributable to the resiliency efforts that the company has made and undergone throughout its kind of history. As it relates to the Greater Houston Resiliency Initiative, this was an initiative implemented in response to and after Hurricane Beryl, and so we had some immediate and near-term commitments to further harden our system for the remainder of the 2024 hurricane season. And so we committed to install additional stronger poles, to conduct additional vegetation management, to further automate our system. And so we've done that, and now we're in phase 2 of the Greater Houston Resiliency Initiative, where we are trying to prep and further enhance the resiliency of our system for this upcoming hurricane season that's to start on June 1st.
Well, soon, so I hope you guys are ready. So, Ryan, what are something that utilities that have implemented LTE networks, what are some resiliency, some responses that they could do that maybe utilities that don't have LTE networks, like what are some of the difference makers when they implement this?
Yeah, I mean, it's really cross-cutting. I mean, it's a lot of the elements that Sam mentioned we see in a lot of the different utilities that are out there, but maybe break it down more fundamentally, outside of the core technologies, grid hardening, and we're familiar with all those applications as utility operators. A big part of one of the macro benefits they get is just a much better picture, situational awareness, real-time visibility of what is actually happening in the grid. It's maybe not amazing to the utility expertise that's here in the room, but I would say to a lot of consumers when I raise this question, do you know how little visibility there actually is in some distribution systems out to different phases of the grid? And a lot of people don't really connect with that. And we've come a long way, with the adoption of smart meters, line sensors, and those kinds of things to get better visibility, but it's still very imperfect. And so utilities that put these systems out all of a sudden, have a, somewhat overwhelming, data set now available to them around what they can do and see and monitor and control in real time on the grid. And that has implications about how they operate the system, how they do storm recovery, ultimately how they dispatch crews, with accuracy and predictability about where they're putting them. And ultimately, it plays into the consumer side because information is power when you're trying to communicate with your consumers, right? How do you can give information back to them, be transparent, and give them predictability about what your activities are, as you're going through storm recovery, in response to be able to be predictive with, restoration times and crew responses and all those kinds of things. And so I think about it as a little bit of a kind of a digital superpower, as you're putting all these pieces together that can make you a smarter, more educated utility on what's going on, in addition to all the technologies that you can ultimately put on top of it.
Thank you for that. Sam, what are you thinking about when you're implementing new technologies as part of your resiliency plan or just in general? I mean, what are you looking at? How are you sort of measuring their success? What are some changes that you've had in the past couple of years in terms of your resiliency approach?
Sure, and I think without technology, we wouldn't be able to function, right? We need technology to monitor and control our system. We need visibility into our system and what it's doing. We need technology for field operations to dispatch our personnel. We need technology to facilitate all the retail market transactions that occur. And so we have approximately 2.8 million smart meters that serve our customers, where we can remotely disconnect and reconnect and do move-out transactions. And so without technology, we wouldn't be able to function, and I suspect the customer dissatisfaction level would rise exponentially. And so the way that we view it is technology is something that enables us to do our job, and we're always mindful in terms of finding that right balance between what's the cost and what's the benefit, right? And we always conduct that analysis in terms of, is the juice worth the squeeze, and what are we getting for what we're paying? And the end goal is always to be efficient, right? To ensure that we have good customer satisfaction. And so if a customer submits a move-in or move-out transaction, we typically do that within 30 minutes, and that's because of the technology. We don't have to go out there and manually turn on a meter or turn off a meter. And so that's kind of our North Star in terms of what's good for the customer, because we always view happy customers means happy stakeholders, means happy regulators. That's good for the company.
So you had mentioned before we came up here that in the wake of Beryl, you did 20 open houses, right? You went out, met with customers. What was some of the feedback that you did get from them? I mean, what's on their mind? We know what we're thinking about resiliency. What are they thinking about?
Sure, and so Beryl happened on July 8th. I think about 2 weeks after Beryl is when we started doing open houses throughout our service area, and we had about 19 of them. And so Beryl was still fresh in customers' memories, and we had a whiteboard where customers could choose in terms of what's important to you, right, as a customer. Number one and number two, I think it was kind of tied. We want you to minimize outages, right? We want you to communicate better with us. And just in terms of the communication piece, and this goes to technology because I think technology really facilitates that communication. Like other utilities, we did have an outage tracker. That's a web-based application that allows customers to see whether there's an outage in their area or an outage in their premise. Prior to Beryl, that outage tracker went down because of heavy usage. And so when Beryl happened, we didn't have that outage tracker up and running. And so there's a psychological frustration that happens when a customer feels like the utility doesn't know that I'm out and the utility doesn't know that I know. And there's a lot of anxiousness that happens because of that outage tracker being out. And I equate it to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? That top hierarchy is safety and security. And without that outage tracker, I think customers felt that the utility didn't see them, the utility didn't understand that they were without power, and so that aspect of safety and security was not met from a psychological perspective, right? The utility can see where there are outages, but the customer just didn't know that. And so from a communication perspective, besides reducing outages, the customers wanted us to communicate better. And so now we have a cloud-based outage tracker that can scale up and scale down depending on internet traffic. To me, it's best in class. Visually, it looks great. It works great. We've tested it. We've stress tested it. And so those were, I think, the two big takeaways in terms of the open houses that we had after Beryl.
I think it was very brave of you to go out post-Beryl and do that, so kudos to you. So Ryan, if a utility is implementing an LTE network, what does that kind of process look like? Are there any service disruptions? And then also keeping the customer in mind, how does this get to the customer? What are they getting from? What benefits are there?
Yeah, no service disruptions. This is very much an additive layer. A couple things that actually come to mind, even connecting back to what Sam was just saying. Let me start with a story. It was actually, we host a gathering of utility executive. We call it our Utility Strategic Advisory Board, but it's really a listening forum. It's a discussion forum, kind of tapping into one of the things that have always excited me the most with the utility industry and our willingness to share and participate, and give lessons learned across industry. And we specifically set up this group to be able to do that. Major East Coast utility, this is a couple, 3 weeks ago, we were brainstorming on, different users' experiences around that adoption cycle and what challenges and stuff they had to overcome to get there. And, they've been exploring, kind of the value proposition and role of broadband for several years. And in an executive conversation that happened, just a few days before that, had asked themselves this fundamental question. It's really about repositioning a little bit, to the concept of outages and what the risk of doing nothing really is. And they asked themselves this question, which I found profound, kind of hearing it, as technical as we all get, and kind of working through details. And they asked themselves this, as utility operators, knowing what we do day in and day out, can we or would we be able to continue to operate the grid if our telecom system went down? And it was a stark look around the room, apparently by description, and the fundamental answer was no. That everything we're doing today as a utility is based on this technology, and that awareness and systems that we're depending on, are as fundamental as the breakers, the switches, the reclosers, the heavy metal, that we're really used to be able to operate the system. And they were coming from a perspective where, they were reliant on, some of these public carrier networks that I was comparing ourselves to earlier in terms of the difference between private. And the next step question for them was, well, what control do we have over that? So it's a fundamental risk to operating our system that in their case today, they have no technical control over it. It's completely in the hands of the carrier and the operator. And I thought that was profound, just to kind of think of the relationship now of the different layers of technology that we got in our system and the criticality that they have that we maybe don't always dissect as much as what we should to be able to understand those dependencies. And so that I find plays into these conversations as we're thinking about these activities with a lot of utilities. And a lot of it then is really about I think of it as kind of the force multiplying effect. With modern technology, what else can we unlock in terms of our capability stack? And how do we, frankly, in some extent, do more while going faster, right? This is an exciting time in the energy landscape. There's so many different things going on that are driving urgency, whether it is, reliability, more dramatic storm impacts, wildfires. We do some work on the West Coast as well, in addition to, clean energy, electric vehicles, demand programs, all those kind of things that, if all taken individually, it can be very overwhelming, to make decisions across all those different priorities where, we more try to approach the conversations with utilities to look more horizontal, look more architecturally at some of those problems and being able to find pieces of solutions that can do more than one thing. And being able to help utilities become more flexible and agile as we do figure out different pieces of technology that we're not building an entire vertical technology stack anymore, but taking advantage of these investments.
And we will be taking questions from the audience, so if anybody does have a question, just feel free to come up to the microphone. So Sam, what is, so severe weather, load growth, what is your biggest concern for challenges to your resiliency at CenterPoint?
Sure, and just to give additional context, the greater Houston area is located near the Gulf Coast of Texas. And according to FEMA and NOAA, that region has the highest weather and climate-related risk in the country. And so out of 100, the greater Houston area gets 100. And so the next closest region in the country is Miami-Dade, which is hurricane-prone. That's in the 70s. And so the greatest challenge to us really is weather-related because we check all the boxes in terms of weather and climate risk. And so we have extreme wind events such as hurricanes, tornadoes, major tropical storms. We have extreme flooding events due to the amount of rain. We have extreme heat events, and that's what we call summer in Houston. We have extreme freeze events, and so we had a freeze this past winter and in 2021 with Winter Storm Uri. And so the biggest challenge to us as it relates to resiliency really is weather-related, and so we do have a current resiliency plan with our regulator that's undergoing review and approval, and we were proposing to spend $5.75 billion over 3 years. Of that $5.75 billion, 4 of that is for just bread and butter hardening for both our transmission and distribution system to address extreme weather events. And so I would say it's very weather and climate related from a resiliency perspective.
And Ryan, I know you, we were talking about specifically what you're doing in Texas here and use cases. I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about that and why Texas is such a great place to be right now with what you're doing.
Yeah, it's interesting when you think about broadband. Kind of broadband unlocks a lot of different things, and as much as I make my way around the country, having conversations with utilities around what problem they're really trying to solve, we find it tends to kind of come back to a few very important things. With some of it, block and tackling, as we talked about, just enablement for grid reliability and resiliency, and we absolutely see some of those elements, driving it here in Texas. LCRA, let me call on them a little bit. Very interesting use case. Lower Colorado River Authority, really looking at added capabilities and features around what can be provided, other constituents across their territory. And, it's a value add of kind of getting into, a larger market opportunity around telecom, the technologies that you're using. Like I said, it's the very same technology that's enabling your cell phones, on your tables there today. And that unlocks a lot of capabilities around voice services and data services, where, a lot of our work is with the larger utilities, the IOUs, and those kind of organizations. Underneath them, and particularly here in Texas, is a lot of municipalities and co-ops. And the ability to provide services and contemplate how to take availability of these new technologies and make services available to others is a really special feature that we see in a lot of different territories. Of course, wildfires, as much as San Diego Gas and Electric was one of our first utility partners, and wildfire mitigation was a core component of what they wanted to implement. A very unique solution called falling conductor protection that was unlocked by capability of having high-speed wireless communications out to the field where their high wildfire risk areas were. But that problem is not, as we've all seen, not a West Coast problem anymore. The amount of conversations that have come inland, from there has been really dramatic over the last 3 or 4 years. And I know it's very relevant here in Texas too. And the ability to port those technologies in and have a much more rapid technology advancement strategy is something that we're seeing more and more, and absolutely fundamental in some of the conversations here in Texas.
Sam, you said, did you want to chime in on that?
Sure. On the wildfire piece, you wouldn't think that the Houston area, being right next to the Gulf Coast and being humid and raining, would have wildfire risk, but under our analysis, there is wildfire risk in the northern and southern parts of our area. And just a couple months ago, there was a wildfire in the Sam Houston National Forest, which is a little bit north of us. And last year, in 2024 spring, there was a wildfire in Brazoria County, which is the south of us. And so what we're seeing is increased weather and climate-related risk, wildfire included.
So we were talking earlier too about communicating the value to the customers, right? Because no matter what you're implementing, somebody does have to pay for it. So, how do you translate all of this kind of underground, in your case, literally underground work, to value for the customer? I mean, how does that get to the end user in a way that they understand and accept?
Sure, I can start. As it relates to the $5.75 billion plan that we've proposed, we've estimated about 1.3 billion in customer minutes interrupted being saved. Can you translate that into tangible dollars? Probably not, right? We'd also identified additional savings as it relates to restoration costs, meaning you wouldn't have to restore as much because your system is better hardened. But those are what I would call hidden costs that we're reducing, but the customer necessarily doesn't see that when it comes to the bill that he or she has to pay.
Ryan, did you want to say something about that too? I saw you with your mic up there.
I will, yeah. I wanted to add to a point that he said earlier. I'm going to put my consumer hat on for a minute, not a technologist anymore. It sounds like you heard this from your feedback sessions too. But what do I want? I mean, we're pretty simple people at the end of the day. We want the lights to go on when we flick the switch. We want it to be reliable. We don't want to suffer, long outages and be uncomfortable and left without our energy. And we want it to be as affordable as possible, right? I think we nailed already, kind of the relationship between technologies and the things that utilities like CenterPoint are doing in terms of how to continue to drive investment to improve the reliability. And I think consumers get a lot of value out of that. And particularly ones that have unfortunately had to survive through some of these difficult natural disasters probably appreciate it a little bit more than others. I find that's another psychological thing as we kind of work our way through. And you said you're from Pittsburgh, you probably appreciate it as much as anybody, and more so today, than maybe you did a while ago. These are the kind of things that I think we just take for granted. When I think about affordability, as we were talking backstage, I mean, let's face it. I mean, there's a lot of investments needed to get the grid where we want to go, and I think that's equally shared by consumers. We need to be smart about how we do that, but it's not free, as we start driving these improvements. And I think we've got to face that reality that there will be costs associated with this, and those costs, at some point, need to be valued and realized as meaningful to us as consumers, but it's something we're going to have to pay for at some point in time. I come back to a point I made earlier when I think about technology adoption. I mean, technology's changed a lot, in the last 10 years, and it's going to continue to do this. I remember, kind of 10, 15 years ago in the utility space, it's like every single solution was a full vertical that a utility was adopting. The business case was built that way. The people were trained that way, and its use and value was really that way. Technology has evolved where I find we've separated a lot of the different pieces of it into specializations, really best in class. As you referenced your cloud software for visibility. I find the same things happening in different realms of technology where you can enable fundamental, more horizontal technology architectures that can be valued, and provide benefit to the consumers in dozens and dozens of use cases. It costs money, but in the long run, it's more affordable because you're getting more leverage from fundamental pieces that you can maintain and you can invest in and you can upgrade. And I think it's an important way to think differently about how we're ultimately driving investment or driving business cases, to be able to look more holistically across the broader portfolio of things we need to do and find synergy, find opportunity to connect to the value across many of the problems all at once.
Thank you for that. Sam, what keeps you up at night in terms of resiliency? What are, just what keeps you up at night?
Yeah, it's always the next weather event, right? When I was younger, I always thought, why do people care about the weather so much? But now that I work for a utility, I understand because a lot of outcomes are driven by weather, right? You want to mitigate what you can forecast and what you anticipate coming down the line. But there are events that you just don't have visibility into or are able to forecast. And one example that I can give is we had an extreme wind event, and the term is called a derecho. We had a derecho last year around May, and it just came out of nowhere. 80-mile-an-hour winds, straight-line winds. It caused about 900,000 outages, and we didn't have time to prep for it because we didn't know it was coming. And so it's really the unknowns that kind of keep you up at night, and the whole purpose of resiliency is to kind of mitigate the impact of those unknowns.
Well, I'm sorry that what keeps you up at night is the one thing you have absolutely zero control over. So we will end it here with some closing remarks. Ryan, I'll start with you.
Yeah, happy to. Great being able to speak with you, here, Sam. I mean, there's, I think, so much to share, in all these different areas of exploration, and I applaud Z Prime again, for continuing to bring us together and have these conversations about sharing, what we're learning and what we're seeing across the industry. It's such a exciting time to be part of this space, and kind of see it and hear my kids talk about it, their excitement in the industry and, kind of what the future holds. But at the same time, we have a lot of work ahead of us. And the one piece I always come back to at the heart of it with times of change, is our pace is going to matter. How we respond to these times is going to matter. And our ability to kind of step up and meet that challenge, I think, is going to continue to be an important hallmark that we're all going to look back on 10 years, 15 years from now, about how successfully we've met some of these changes. But it is exciting.
Sam?
Sure, and I think the concept and theme of resiliency is going to be bigger and bigger in our industry. For the longest time, it used to be reliability, and I would distinguish reliability and resiliency in the sense that reliability is how good are you on blue sky days. Resiliency is how much of a punch can you take and how long does it take you to recover from that punch. And so I think utilities are now thinking more along the lines of resiliency. I will say in Texas, Texas really borrowed what Florida did as it relates to storm protection plans and passing resiliency legislation. And I think you'll start seeing more and more utilities kind of latch onto that theme of resiliency. I know Louisiana is doing it, and I think other states and utilities will follow suit.
Thank you. Could I get a round of applause, please, for my panelists here today? Ryan and Sam, thank you guys so much for joining us. I could have chatted all day, but we're on a schedule. Thanks, guys. I'll hand it back over to Jason.